This is Group Three's final presentation from Mark Jones, Mark Anderson, and Jared Maddox, where we will be looking at break-even analysis for a firm providing engineering services. This is Mark Anderson. I'll be discussing our intro, primary purpose, and learning objective. For conversation purposes, we created a small engineering firm called I Know Everything Engineering, or IKE. We're a service-driven company, which is not as straightforward as the manufacturing industry for calculating the costs associated with each job or project. To help with clarity on this discussion, we will be going into a detailed analysis on activity-based costing to derive our total overhead costs. Our primary purpose of our project is to arrive at a break-even point for IKE. With a service-driven company, we will look at the projects with the necessary number of hours to break even. And again, we will do this using activity-based costing to ensure a project is not overbid or underbid. Correctly assessing fixed and variable expenses at which our engineering services are sold will be key. And our final learning objective will be able to provide accurate recommendations to IKE based on the activity-based costing method and the break-even analysis discussed.
This is Jared Maddox, and I will be discussing the steps that were taken to determine the break-even point for the engineering firm IKE. The first step was to define the activities, the cost pools, and the activity measures. The activity cost pools that were selected were the number of projects, the project size, client relations, and other. The corresponding activity measures were the number of projects, the number of engineering and drafting hours, the number of active clients, and not applicable for the other activity cost pool. The second was to estimate the annual overhead costs for a small firm like IKE, and this was done using internet research as well as other industry averages. For instance, office utilities and office lease were calculated using the values typically found in the Central Valley. The third step was to develop the distribution of resource consumption matrix across all activity cost pools. This was done using previous experience as well as a little bit of guesswork to come up with this table. The next step was to assign overhead costs to the activity pools, and this can be seen in this next table where those costs were assigned to each of the corresponding pools. It should be noted that the totals does equal the total overhead costs for IKE for that year. Next, the activity rates were calculated. There were some assumptions used to determine the total number of projects that IKE would typically see in a year. That value was chosen to be 80 projects. The project size, the activity was calculated to be 6,864 hours. This is the assumption of how many drafting and engineering hours of direct labor that IKE would perform in a year. And the number of clients was assumed to be 70. This obviously has to be less than or equal to 80 because there can't be more clients than projects. So the 70 value seemed fair, and it also allowed for some clients to have multiple projects with IKE.
So this is Mark Jones. We'll be talking about the break-even point for a minimum project size to break even if we build this out at cost. So if that's at cost for the engineering and drafting hours. So for any project at IKE, 16 hours, the project needs to be, if anything below that, the company would take a loss. Anything above that would be at profit. So when searching for projects and bidding out, we would want to search for ones that are above 16 hours or cost them or invoice them accordingly. So this is an example from our project going through the break-even analysis on project XYZ. So this is the activity rates from this project size and for this project. So that's 170 hours, 100 of those are which are engineering hours and 70 of those are drafting hours. So on the bottom left is the labor rate costs assumptions that we did. The engineering cost per hour equated to $48 an hour. The drafting cost per hour is $30 per hour. So totaling up the direct labor and overhead costs, this project XYZ equated out to about $8,000. So for this project, any cost below that, the company, Ike, would take a loss, and anything above that, the company would profit from.
This is Mark Anderson. I'll be concluding with recommendations for the firm. Taking on any projects below the break-even point that we discovered of 16 hours would result in a net loss, so we recommend to Ike to avoid projects such as these. We advise him to look and bid on larger projects to drive up the company's net income. And any jobs placed or bidded on below 16 hours should only be done so to build new business for Ike and the firm at large. This concludes our project. Thank you.